Imagine waking up one day and realizing that every choice you've ever made, from the smallest hesitation to the largest life decision, wasn't entirely yours. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, not just seeing your reflection, but sensing that there is someone else there with you, watching silently, waiting. This other you doesn't speak in words, doesn't announce its presence, but it influences what you fear, what you crave, what you avoid, and what you pursue. You try to shake the thought away, telling yourself that you are the master of your own will, but then a chilling question surfaces. What if you've been carrying a hidden stranger inside of you all along, a presence that shapes your desires, sabotages your relationships, and even determines the path of your life, without ever asking your permission? This stranger has a name, though not one you often hear whispered outside the language of psychology and philosophy. Carl Jung called it the shadow. The paradox is unsettling. You are both the person you know and the person you refuse to know. You are the virtues you proudly display and the impulses you desperately bury. You are the light that shines before others and the darkness that crouches behind closed doors. And yet, most people live their entire lives never confronting this contradiction, never realizing that what they call their decisions are often negotiations with the unseen half of themselves. Have you ever wondered why you suddenly lash out at someone you love over something trivial, as if some hidden reservoir of anger took over before you had the chance to think? Or why you sabotage your own success, repeating cycles of failure that make no logical sense? Have you ever wondered why you are drawn to people who seem to embody everything you despise? Or why your dreams conjure strange, forbidden images you'd never confess to another soul? These are not accidents. They are the whispers of the shadow, trying to remind you that the person you think you are is only half the story. The frightening truth is this: every human being walks through life carrying a hidden double. For some, it lurks quietly, erupting only in moments of stress or weakness. For others, it dominates them entirely, pulling them into self-destruction, addictions, betrayals, and obsessions they later claim they never intended. But what if the shadow isn't merely a source of chaos? What if it's also the hidden engine of creativity, courage, and transformation? What if, by denying it, you are cutting yourself off from the deepest reservoir of your own power? This is the paradox Jung wrestled with. The shadow is not just the bad within us, but the unlived potential, the repressed desires, the forgotten strengths that we cannot yet admit. The shadow is both monster and muse, destroyer and creator, saboteur and savior. But here's the question that should unsettle you most. If every decision you make is touched in some way by the shadow, then do you truly have free will? Or are you a puppet pulled by strings woven in the hidden caverns of your own psyche? When you chose your career, was it ambition or was it fear of being seen as weak? When you entered a relationship, was it love or was it the unconscious hunger to relive patterns etched in childhood? When you walked away from opportunities, did you act out of wisdom or did the shadow whisper hesitation into your bones? How many of your regrets, your triumphs, your entire sense of self are the result of forces you never dared to face directly? We live in an age obsessed with identity, with being true to yourself, with curating an image of authenticity. But how authentic can anyone truly be if half of the self remains hidden in the dark? What if the greatest illusions are not the lies society sought? I tells you, but the lies you tell yourself to avoid staring into the abyss of your own shadow? Perhaps the most terrifying possibility is not that you are being controlled by governments, by corporations, or by algorithms, but that you are being controlled by the very part of you that you refuse to acknowledge exists. And so the great question rises like a storm on the horizon. Are you willing to confront the shadow that shapes every decision you make? Or will you spend your life haunted by a ghost that never reveals its face, never stops pulling your strings, until the day you realize, too late, that you never truly lived as yourself? The stage is set. The mirror is waiting. The question hangs in the air like smoke. What would happen if you finally turned to face the stranger within? The hidden problem begins with a truth so uncomfortable that most of us instinctively recoil from it. You are not who you think you are. Your carefully crafted identity, the one you present to others, the one you rehearse in mirrors, the one you defend when criticized, is only a fragment of your total being. Jung called this visible layer the persona, the mask you wear in society to function, to belong, to be accepted. It is the smiling face you bring to work, the agreeable voice you use in conversations, the rational explanation you give for your actions. But behind this persona lies the shadow, the accumulation of everything you reject, deny, or repress about yourself. It is not simply the evil or immoral as many assume, but the inconvenient, the vulnerable, the socially unacceptable, the impulses that make you too strange, too weak, or too dangerous to reveal. To build a persona, you must exile a shadow, and every exile, every suppression comes with a cost. Why does this division exist at all? At its root, the shadow is born from survival. From childhood onward, you learn what earns approval and what provokes rejection. A child who is praised for being quiet learns to suppress their rage. A child punished for vulnerability learns to hide their tears. A child who receives love for achievement learns to banish laziness, hesitation, or playfulness. Piece by piece, your psyche constructs a version of yourself that can move through the world without punishment. Yet every piece of you that does not fit into this polished mask does not vanish. It sinks into the unconscious, forming the shadow. Nietzsche warned of this dynamic when he wrote, "Be careful, lest in casting out your demon you cast out the best thing in you." What society calls acceptable often amputates your wholeness. The result is a split being, a conscious self that lives in the daylight of social expectation and a buried self that roams the twilight of your inner world. From a psychological standpoint, repression is not neutral, it creates pressure. Think of the unconscious as a sealed chamber beneath your house. Every time you repress an emotion or desire, you toss it into that chamber and lock the door. But the chamber does not remain still. It expands, groans, and leaks into your waking life in disguised forms. Sudden outbursts of anger, irrational fears, uncontrollable cravings, or recurring dreams. Freud compared repression to forcing thoughts under water. They will always resurface, often in distorted and unexpected ways. Jung went further, suggesting that the shadow has an autonomy of its own, almost as if it were a living entity inside you, with its own will, its own agenda. It waits for moments of weakness to seize control, erupting in ways that make you say afterward, "I don't know what came over me." Philosophically, the existence of the shadow forces us to grapple with questions of authenticity and freedom. Sartre believed that human beings are condemned to freedom. We are always free to choose, yet most of us flee from this freedom into bad faith, deceiving ourselves to avoid responsibility. The shadow thrives in turn. His deception. To admit its presence is to acknowledge that much of what you do is driven by forces outside your conscious control. Schopenhauer, centuries earlier, hinted at this when he described the will as the blind, irrational force that governs life, indifferent to reason or morality. The shadow, in many ways, is the face of this will within the human psyche, the raw, unrefined power of instinct and desire, dressed in masks of shame or fear when seen through the lens of society. But why is it so difficult to acknowledge this truth? Because to face the shadow is to dismantle the comfortable illusions that hold your life together. You believe you are kind, yet you discover a reservoir of cruelty within you. You believe you are honest, yet you find moments of cowardly deceit. You believe you are strong, yet you uncover the fear and fragility you have hidden from others and from yourself. The ego resists this confrontation because it threatens its integrity. To look into the shadow is to admit that you are not singular but multiple, not pure but contradictory, not fully in control but partly enslaved. This is why Jung insisted that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. To awaken is not to deny the shadow, but to confront it directly. And yet, there is an even deeper dimension. The shadow is not only personal, it is collective. Every culture, every society, every nation has a shadow. Just as individuals repress unwanted traits, societies repress their inconvenient truths. A nation that prides itself on freedom may repress the violence it enacts to maintain that freedom. A culture that celebrates purity may repress its secret fascinations with what it condemns. Aldous Huxley once remarked that the greatest atrocities are committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who remain unconscious of the shadow forces moving through them. When groups deny their collective shadow, it erupts in mass hysteria, scapegoating, or systemic cruelty. The witch hunts of the Middle Ages, the genocides of the 20th century, the moral panics of today, all are examples of the collective shadow breaking free, disguised as righteousness, when in fact it is the disowned darkness of society unleashed. Thus, the hidden problem is this: every decision you make is shaped by a battle you cannot see, between the self you acknowledge and the self you exile. You believe you are rational, yet unconscious complexes tug at your will. You believe you are moral, yet suppressed impulses warp your judgment. You believe you are free, yet the shadow whispers beneath your choices, steering you with invisible hands. And the more you deny it, the stronger it grows. To live without confronting the shadow is to live half a life dictated by forces you refuse to name. But here is the paradox that deepens the problem. The shadow is not only a danger, but also a gift. The impulses you repress are not merely destructive, they are also creative. The anger you deny could be the source of your courage. The fear you suppress could be the seed of your humility. The forbidden desires you bury could contain the energy for art, love, or transformation. Jung believed that the shadow, once integrated, becomes a wellspring of strength. But before integration comes confrontation. And confrontation requires the courage to ask, what parts of myself have I thrown into exile, and how are they returning to haunt me? This is the root of the great hidden problem. Not that you have a shadow, but that you refuse to see it. And as long as you look away, your shadow will continue to shape your life in silence. The question is no longer whether the shadow exists, it does. The question is, how long can you live without facing it? Imagine trying to steer a ship while blindfolded, feeling only the tug of invisible currents beneath the surface. That is what it means to live with an unacknowledged shadow. You tell your self you are guiding the vessel of your life with reason and willpower, but in truth, the undercurrents of repressed desires, fears, and unexamined impulses are what nudge your course. Left unseen, the shadow does not simply lie dormant. It leaks, it seeps, it whispers. The unseen consequences of ignoring it shape the very fabric of your existence, often in ways you mistake for fate or bad luck, when in reality they are the echoes of what you have tried hardest to deny. One of the most insidious consequences is projection. Jung described projection as the unconscious act of attributing your own repressed qualities onto others. What you cannot tolerate in yourself, you will inevitably see in the people around you. This is why you might despise arrogance in others while secretly hiding your own pride, or why you are intolerant of weakness in others while burying your own vulnerability. Projection explains why your strongest reactions to people, whether obsessive attraction or burning hatred, often reveal more about you than about them. It is not the person you love or loathe, but the shadow qualities they mirror back to you. Think of the enemy you demonize, the celebrity you idolize, the colleague who irritates you without reason. Each one is a distorted reflection of your own unconscious. Left unchecked, projection creates cycles of misunderstanding, conflict, and resentment, because you are not relating to people as they are. You are relating to the shadow you refuse to acknowledge. Another consequence emerges in self-sabotage. How often do you set goals for yourself, only to derail them in ways that seem inexplicable? You commit to a healthy lifestyle, then binge on destructive habits. You long for intimacy, yet push people away when they get close. You work hard for success, only to stumble at the moment of opportunity. These are not mere accidents. They are the handiwork of the shadow, the parts of you that feel threat. Tend by change, by growth, by exposure. When the conscious self says, "I want this," but the shadow whispers, "I am afraid of what will happen if you succeed," the unconscious wins more often than not. This inner sabotage can hollow out a life, leaving a trail of abandoned dreams and silent regrets. There is also the corrosive effect on relationships. The shadow seeps into intimacy in subtle but devastating ways. Couples often fall into cycles of blame and resentment because they are unknowingly wrestling not only with each other, but with each other's shadows. A man who represses his dependence may unconsciously demand control, projecting weakness onto his partner. A woman who denies her aggression may unconsciously sabotage, projecting cruelty onto the one she loves. Friendships fracture under the weight of unspoken shadow dynamics. Families repeat patterns of trauma across generations, and societies fracture into factions, all because no one sees that the battle is not against the other, but against the unacknowledged darkness within. The unseen consequences are not limited to personal relationships. They extend to creativity, morality, and even societal structures. Consider creativity. The greatest works of art often emerge from an encounter with the shadow. Dostoevsky, Kafka, Picasso, Sylvia Plath all wrestled with their inner darkness, channeling it into literature, painting, or poetry. But when the shadow is not integrated, creativity can collapse into destruction. What could have been art becomes addiction. What could have been innovation becomes obsession. What could have been passion becomes chaos. The choice is not whether the shadow will express itself, but how. It will either be given voice in conscious creation or erupt through unconscious destruction. Morality, too, is distorted by the shadow's unseen hand. When people repress their own immoral impulses, they often compensate by overemphasizing moral purity. This explains the hypocrisy of leaders who preach virtue but act with vice, or the cruelty of ideologies that cloak themselves in righteousness while committing atrocities. Jung warned that the greater the denial of the shadow, the more violently it will erupt when given the chance. History confirms this. Puritanical societies that conceal sexuality often produce scandals. Regimes that claim moral superiority often commit crimes against humanity. What is denied within the individual becomes magnified within the collective, turning societies into theaters where shadows dance under the illusion of light. Neurology and cognitive science add another layer to this picture. Studies show that much of our decision-making originates in the unconscious mind before we are even aware of choosing. Neural impulses spark milliseconds before conscious thought. This means that the shadow, lodged deep in the unconscious, influences not only your emotions, but also the very process of choice itself. You believe you are choosing freely, but your brain may have already leaned toward the option aligned with your unconscious patterns. Add to this the weight of cognitive biases, confirmation bias, projection bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect, and you begin to see how profoundly the unseen governs your life. You are not the rational agent you imagine. You are a being steered by unseen forces, rationalizing after the fact why you acted as you did. Perhaps the most haunting consequence of ignoring the shadow is the loss of authenticity. Every time you exile a part of yourself, you shrink. You become a version of yourself designed to be palatable, acceptable, safe, but not whole. This partial self may win approval, but it cannot experience true freedom. People live decades in this diminished form, never realizing that the emptiness they feel, the quiet despair, the endless search for external validation, all stem from the disowned parts of their own soul. Viktor Frankl, writing from the depths of a concentration camp, argued that human beings can endure almost any suffering if they find meaning. But how can one find meaning if one is divided against oneself? How can one live a full life when one's truest impulses are left to rot in the unconscious? The consequences spiral outward. On the societal level, collective shadows manifest in nationalism, racism, and moral panics. Groups scapegoat minorities, demonize outsiders, or wage wars under the illusion of virtue, never realizing that the enemy they fight outside is the very darkness they refuse to face within. On the personal level, unacknowledged shadows erode marriages, hollow out friendships, stunt potential, and leave a trail of quiet misery. The most dangerous shadows are not the ones that erupt in obvious violence, but the ones that quietly erode your spirit day by day, convincing you that you are living freely, when in truth you are living under chains of your own denial. And yet, this realization carries with it a strange kind of liberation. If your life is being shaped by unseen forces, then to see them, even to glimpse them, is to reclaim power. The shadow is not destiny. It is only fate if it remains unconscious. Once brought to light, it becomes energy, possibility, and transformation. But the path to this liberation requires rebellion, the courage to turn inward, to question everything you thought was true about yourself, and to face the stranger within. And so, the stage darkens once again. The question lingers. If the unseen consequences have already been shaping your life in silence, what might happen if you dared to step into the rebellion, to break free of the shadow's grip and wrestle with it face to face? The rebellion. How to break free. Rebellion begins the moment you admit you are not who you thought you were. It is the instant you look into the mirror of your life and refuse to be comforted by the reflection you have asked for years. Breaking free from the shadow is not about annihilating it, nor is it about drowning in its darkness. It is about confronting, integrating, and ultimately transforming it. Jung warned that the shadow is 90% pure gold, meaning that the qualities we fear most within ourselves, once acknowledged, often become the very source of our strength. But how does one break free from chains forged by one's own unconscious? How do you rebel against a master that hides inside you? The first act of rebellion is radical honesty. This is not the polished honesty of polite confessions, but the brutal honesty that strips away illusion. It begins with asking, what do I secretly envy? Who do I irrationally hate? What fantasies do I bury before they reach the surface? These uncomfortable questions pierce the armor of the persona and reveal the outlines of the shadow. To admit, I am capable of cruelty, I am afraid of intimacy, or I hunger for power, is to take the first step toward reclaiming what was exiled. Many resist this honesty because they fear it will consume them. But denial does not protect, it enslaves. The rebel knows that only by naming the shadow can its power be transformed. The second act of rebellion is shadow work itself, the process of integrating the darkness rather than banishing it. Jungian psychology encourages practices such as dream analysis, journaling, and active imagination, where one confronts the images of the unconscious directly. Dreams, for example, often reveal shadow material in symbolic form: the pursuer in a nightmare, the forbidden lover, the grotesque figure lurking in the background. Instead of dismissing these images, the rebel asks, what part of me is this figure trying to represent? What energy, what truth have I repressed so deeply that it now speaks through dream and symbol? To dialogue with these figures, to write to them, to imagine conversations with them, is to invite the shadow into consciousness. Philosophically, breaking free means embracing paradox. Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, the one who creates values rather than inheriting them, resonates here. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim the power to define yourself beyond societal conditioning. It means recognizing that you contain both angel and beast, saint and sinner, light and darkness. The rebel refuses simplistic categories of good and evil, instead choosing wholeness over purity. As Jung observed, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Freedom is not found in perfection, but in embracing contradiction. This rebellion also requires courage, the courage to see yourself not as you wish to be, but as you are. Sartre believed that authenticity arises only when we stop fleeing from our freedom and take responsibility for the totality of our being. To integrate the shadow is to shoulder this responsibility, to admit that every hateful thought, every selfish impulse, every destructive urge is part of the human condition and part of you. This is not an excuse for indulgence, but an invitation to awareness. For when you are aware of your shadow, you can choose. When you are unconscious of it, it chooses for you. Consider those who have embodied this rebellion. Gandhi, who confessed to wrestling with violence within himself, transformed that energy into a philosophy of non-violent resistance. Martin Luther King Jr., who acknowledged his own human weaknesses, channeled them into a movement grounded in compassion rather than denial. Even great artists, from Van Gogh to Frida Kahlo, turned their shadows into works of creation that shook the world. Each rebel refused to remain blind. Each rebel chose to confront the darkness, not to be consumed by it, but to transmute it into light. On a practical level, breaking free often requires ritual and discipline. One must develop practices that ground the confrontation with the shadow, so it does not overwhelm. Meditation can serve as a mirror, revealing thoughts and impulses without judgment. Writing daily reflections can capture the shadow's whispers before they erupt. Creative expression, Painting, music, storytelling gives form to the repressed energies, releasing them in symbolic rather than destructive ways. And relationships, when built on radical honesty, become laboratories for shadow work, where partners serve as mirrors reflecting back what we deny. These practices do not destroy the shadow. They teach you to live with it consciously, transforming it from saboteur into ally. Yet rebellion is never without risk. To face the shadow is to encounter discomfort, shame, even terror. The rebel may feel as if they are losing themselves, because in a way they are. The false self, the mask, begins to crack. Jung compared this process to alchemy. The lead of repression must be burned, dissolved, and transformed before it becomes gold. This transformation is not pleasant, but it is necessary. Those who turn away at this stage retreat into denial, resuming lives of quiet self-betrayal. But those who persist emerge with a freedom unknown to most. The freedom to act not from compulsion, but from choice, not from fear, but from wholeness. There is also a deeper rebellion here, one against society itself. For just as individuals exile their shadows, cultures do the same. To integrate one's personal shadow is to resist the collective illusions of one's time. It is to see through the scapegoating, the propaganda, the moral posturing of the crowd, and to say, the darkness is not out there, but also within me. This recognition breeds humility, empathy, and courage. It arms the rebel against the temptations of moral superiority and the seductions of tribal hatred. In a world where societies endlessly project their shadows onto enemies, the individual who integrates their own shadow becomes a revolutionary force for peace. Ultimately, rebellion against the shadows. Is rebellion for the self, for authenticity, for freedom, for life itself. It is the refusal to remain divided, the refusal to live as a ghost of one's true potential. It is the embrace of the paradox that you are both light and dark, both hero and villain, both capable of cruelty and compassion. And it is the commitment to live with this knowledge, not in despair, but in strength. But there is still one more threshold to cross. To rebel is to begin the journey of integration. Yet beyond rebellion lies something greater, revelation. For once you face the shadow, once you integrate its darkness into your being, you discover not just freedom from unconscious compulsion, but a deeper truth about the nature of reality itself. The shadow does not merely shape your choices, it shapes your perception of the world. And to integrate it is to awaken to a truth so radical it redefines the meaning of existence. The ultimate truth. The final, most powerful realization. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast abyss, staring into darkness so deep it feels like eternity itself. You have walked through denial, faced the hidden problem, endured the unseen consequences, and rebelled against the prison of the unconscious. But now, at the end of the journey, you arrive at the ultimate threshold. What is the shadow really? Is it merely a psychological construct, a storage of repressed impulses, or is it something far greater, something that speaks to the very fabric of what it means to be human? To arrive here is to confront the most powerful realization. The shadow is not simply the darkness within you, it is the doorway to wholeness, the bridge between illusion and reality. The final truth is paradoxical. You have spent your life fleeing from the shadow because you believed it to be the enemy. You have projected it onto others, feared its eruptions, and tried to bury it beneath your persona. But in truth, the shadow has always been your twin, your teacher, the missing half of your soul. To live without it is to live incomplete. The shadow is the keeper of everything you disowned, the guardian of the unlived life. To integrate it is not merely to become better adjusted or more balanced, it is to become whole. And wholeness is not purity, it is contradiction embraced, light and dark held in the same hand. Jung once said, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." This is the ultimate truth. To rise, you must descend. To find your highest self, you must embrace your lowest depths. Philosophically, this realization shatters the illusion of a divided world. We are taught to see existence in binaries, good versus evil, light versus dark, self versus other. But the shadow reveals that these divisions are illusions of the mind. There is no good without evil, no light without darkness, no self without the other. The ultimate truth is unity, but unity that is born of paradox, not avoidance. To deny the shadow is to cling to a false duality. To embrace it is to awaken to the interconnectedness of all things. This is why mystics across traditions, whether Christian, Buddhist, Sufi, or Taoist, speak of confronting the dark night of the soul before attaining illumination. The shadow is not a detour from enlightenment, it is the very path toward it. Psychologically, this realization liberates you from compulsion. Once you recognize the shadow as part of yourself, you no longer need to project it onto others. You no longer need to demonize your enemies or idolize your heroes. You begin to see that what you hated in others was your own disowned reflection, and what you adored was your unlived potential. This revelation brings humility. You are not as innocent as you believed, nor as monstrous as you feared. You are both. And with humility comes freedom. The freedom to act not from denial or fear, but from awareness. The integrated self does not need to wear masks, because it has nothing left to hide. But the ultimate realization goes even deeper. The shadow does not only shape your choices, it shapes your perception of reality itself. When you repress parts of yourself, you also repress the ability to perceive the world fully. You filter reality through the narrow lens of your persona, seeing only what fits your self-image and ignoring what threatens it. But when you integrate the shadow, your vision expands. You begin to see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. You notice the humanity in your enemies, the fragility in the powerful, the strength in the weak. You realize that the universe is not a battlefield of opposites, but a tapestry of interwoven contradictions. This shift in perception is nothing less than a rebirth of consciousness. Consider what happens when societies integrate their collective shadows. When nations admit their past crimes, they open the door to reconciliation. When cultures confront their hypocrisies, they create space for genuine progress. The same applies to the individual. When you acknowledge your shadow, you open yourself to compassion, both for yourself and for others. You no longer need to judge so harshly because you recognize the same darkness within you. You no longer need to fear failure because you have befriended the part of you that fails. And you no longer need to chase external validation because you have embraced the fullness of who you are. This final truth is both terrifying and liberating. The shadow is not your enemy, it is your guide. It has always been pulling at you, not to destroy you, but to awaken you. The mistakes, the conflicts, the self-sabotage, the haunting dreams, these were not punishments, but invitations. Each time the shadow surfaced, it was asking you to look deeper, to see what you had abandoned, to reclaim the pieces of your soul. To rebel against it was only the beginning. To embrace it full is the culmination. You realize now that the shadow has never been outside you. It has always been you. And so, the ultimate realization emerges. Freedom is not found in conquering the shadow, nor in denying it, but in dancing with it. To live fully is to carry both light and darkness with dignity. To love fully is to see both the flaws and the beauty in others without projection. To create fully is to harness both the chaos of the unconscious and the clarity of reason. The shadow teaches that life is not about purity, but about integration, not about perfection, but about wholeness. As you stand at this threshold, the paradox crystallizes. The shadow you feared was the key to your liberation. The enemy you tried to silence was your truest ally. The darkness you fled was the womb of your light, and the life you thought you were living was only half a life until now. So the final, most powerful realization is this. Every decision you make, every path you take, every love you embrace, every fear you flee, each is shaped not by the self you show the world, but by the self you hide. To live authentically, you must walk hand in hand with your shadow, allowing it to speak, to teach, to guide. Only then can you claim the full measure of your humanity. The journey ends where it began, with a mirror. But now, when you look, you no longer see just a mask. You see two faces, joined as one, the persona and the shadow, the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the dark. And for the first time, you do not turn away. You smile, because you understand. You are whole.